And welcome everybody. As Emma said, I'm Helen Hendry. I'm a former primary teacher and teacher trainer, and now I'm a senior lecturer in primary education at the Open University. And my research focuses on reading for pleasure with children and educators. I'm lucky enough to co-direct the Open University Centre for Literacy and Social Justice with Professor Teresa Kremin. And as Emma mentioned, we worked with colleagues at the Reading Agency to establish the Teachers Reading Challenge a few years ago. So I'm really excited this afternoon to introduce the rest of the panel. First, there's Darren Chetty, who is a lecturer at UCL and an affiliate at the Sarah Parker Ramon Centre for the Study of Racism and Racialisation. Darren taught in primary schools for over 20 years and now works extensively on curriculum, pedagogy, and representation in children's literature. He's also a writer with work spanning philosophy for children, essays on race and culture, and books for young readers. Darren also co-authors the long-running Beyond the Secret Garden column, exploring Black and racially minoritised characters in children's literature, which is really so fantastic. If you haven't accessed it, do. Next, we have Ken Wilson-Max. Ken is an award-winning author, illustrator, and now publisher, committed to creating books in which all children can see themselves. In 2017, he took over Alana Max Books, and in 2021 joined HarperCollins Children's Books to set up their Kamusha Books imprint, focused on inclusive publishing. Kamusha, a Shona word for home, captures his mission to make books a place where all children feel safe and represented. And we're also delighted to have Farhana Islam with us. Farhana is both a primary school teacher and an author, and her debut novel, The Misadventures of Mina Mahmood, brings humour and heart to children's fiction, while her picture book, Not Now Nor, has been warmly received by families and educators alike. As an author ambassador for the Teachers Reading Challenge, Farhana is passionate about empowering diverse voices and showing how inclusive books can make a real difference in the classroom. And I'm really excited to hear from Farhana and Ken and Darren as we move through our questions today. For today's discussion, we're going to be talking about representation in children's books. And when we talk about that, we're drawing on the work of Professor Rudine Sims Bishop and her 1990s metaphor, which some of you probably come across before, of books as windows, mirrors, and sliding doors. We're talking about seeing yourself reflected, children being able to find characters, families, communities, and experiences in books that connect with their own lives and identities. But also seeing beyond yourself. So, children have the chance to encounter different perspectives, cultures, and lived experiences that expand their horizons. So, when the panel is reflecting on breadth this afternoon, on representation this afternoon, it's about relevance and breadth, making sure that every child feels visible in stories, whilst opening these windows into other lives, encouraging reflection and understanding on both sides of sliding glass doors between different communities. Of course, representation in itself can cover a wide range of areas: race, culture, language, gender, disability, family structures, class, geography, and more. We won't cover all of that in depth today, but our focus will be on how inclusive books help children feel both recognised and connected so that more of them can experience the joy of reading. And we know from our research at the Open University that children's motivation to read is strongly supported by seeing themselves in text and connecting to what they're reading. So it's really important. So as we move to hear from the panel now, we often hear the phrase representation matters. So I'm going to be asking the panel to think about this a bit more. What does this actually mean for a child's self-perception and reading identity in the classroom? So I'm going to start by turning to Darren. And Darren, drawing on your academic work and classroom experience, do you have an idea or something to share about what you see as the fundamental psychological link between a child seeing themselves in a book and their motivation to read for pleasure?
Oh, starting with a
It's a
big,
big question,
yeah.
yeah.
Well, I'd probably put in a few caveats here. I want to obviously say that reading is really important, children's literature is really important. At the same time, we can see generations of black and brown writers who have emerged despite the fact that what they read at school might have been all exclusively white writers. So I don't want to get anything too deterministic. But you pointed to Rudy Sims Bishop's research, which itself, that metaphor came from Emily Stiles' work on the curriculum as windows and mirrors. And I think what I've tried to do in my work, and particularly in that essay in The Good Immigrant, was to point out that children's literature is important as something that's crucial within a broader framework of the curriculum, which itself is in a broader framework of culture and the media. So we can sort of almost in Venn diagrams, we can build out and we can see that problems about representation, problems about implicit hierarchies are there in society. They're not only a school problem by any means. But when we're there as teachers, it might be that children's literature is one of the places, hopefully along with the curriculum, where we can exercise some degree of agency and do something useful in intervening. And I think it is intervening because we use this term inclusive children's literature, but I think it's worth thinking back of what that's a response to, which is children's literature that is largely exclusive. It's excluded, the majority of the world's population, and that has been how British children's literature, classic children's literature, came into being. We talk about how, in the very earliest stages of British children's literature, where there were racially minoritized people or people of color, they were there almost as subhumans, the most obvious being going right back to Robinson Crusoe. And then as that sort of era went away, which I guess we were talking about the height of the British Empire when people would talk about white supremacy without any sense of embarrassment, we moved to something where there was kind of an erasure of racially minoritized people, or they were there in allegorical form. And it's really been a 21st century phenomenon to have children's literature where people of color are presented as fully human with agency. There are exceptions, but in terms of general patterns.
Mm.
And I'll just say one final thing on the sort of psychological side, which is if we go to the United States, and there are differences between the UK and the United States, then in the decision to desegregate schools or to outlaw segregated schools, a big part of that was the work of two black psychologists, Kenneth and Mamie Clark, who were husband and wife, and what was known as the doll test. And I just happen to have a very recent book that was published on this, the doll test. And what they found was that black children and white children, when asked questions about black and white dolls, such as who is the good one, who is the clever one, who would you like to be your friend, chose the white doll. And this was crucial in the argument that segregated schools were harming black children. But the the interesting thing is that even as segregation was outlawed, when these doll tests have been repeated, we've still found they're quite similar results because of the pervasiveness of this sort of hierarchy in our visual landscape, in the way society is structured. And back to that Good Immigrant essay, what started this inquiry for me was when a young black boy age 6 said to their peer, stories have to be about white people, and that they had already by 6 years old read their social world in such a way that they come to that conclusion. And when I share this with teachers, sometimes teachers say, I don't think that would happen now. Sometimes they're less confident. I think we're still engaging in that process, and that having the ability to find books where you people from your community are seen to be of sufficient value to be in books is important, even though you might not always want to read those books. Might want to read about anything. You might want to read about Martians. That's absolutely fine. We shouldn't have a one-to-one correspondence. But knowing that we are valuable enough to be in books is a huge part, I think, of having a sort of healthy self-image and of not only recognizing self-esteem, but reading the institutional esteem of how school sees us.
Mm. Thank you so much, Darren. That's really, really an interesting place to start. And I do think, yeah, setting the context, the wider context is really important because we're trying through the use of children's literature to challenge, discuss, open up some of those areas. But of course, we're not changing the whole context by doing so. So, yeah, that's a lot to reflect on. Thank you so much. Ken, so to you now, as both an author and a publisher, you've got a unique view of the creative process. Um, how does inclusive publishing fundamentally change the kind of stories that get told? You know, there Darren's given that really clear picture of the challenges over the years that have existed in the way that racially minoritized people might be represented in children's literature. Um, how does inclusive publishing fundamentally change that? And why is that important for the school market? Ken, you're on mute, I think.
The main goal of the main goal of inclusive or representative publishing is to create stories whereby people can see themselves and their friends, right, as equals, as in the most positive light possible, almost to address the imbalance, to try to address the imbalance of what has been happening before, right? And so I think inclusive books have an opportunity to show different perspectives on very similar stories. I often think about bigger publishers and their huge backlists, and I always think for every book that's been published, there is an inclusive version waiting to be written, right? So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can actually use what's there, recast it, create something that is new, but based on something that has a good commercial merit, if I can put it that way. Because I think most publishers are still grappling with the idea of inclusive publishing and the length of time it takes for it to become a little bit more mainstream, and of course to generate the money which allows them to keep doing that. So that cycle also has to be brought into the argument, especially when you're talking about the pace of change. Right. So this is my 30th year as a published author, and I can say that I still have I'm still at step one, which is just to be recognized, just to get books out there, more of them, where people are recognized as the same, equal, or as interesting as the mainstream. And so on the other hand, in terms of the actual publishing, I think there's been more and more independent publishers that have taken this up, and that's all they do. And I think they are the ones who are looking at the market and innovating a lot more than the bigger publishers, for various reasons. Again, with business, it always comes down to finance and the ability to move through and follow trends. But I think overall, in terms of the actual publishing happening, there's a much better throughput of stories coming through, many more creatives coming through. And perhaps the challenge now is still on the other side, where the book meets the buyer. Like, how many people know these books exist? How do we make sure that we can reach our main audience and our intended audience together? So there's a lot of these questions which are being asked at the moment, and we really are at the intersection of cultural and sort of commerce. It's really, this is it now. For the last 5 years, we've been there, and we're still there trying to. And someone is going to break through, I do believe. So lists like Kumusha are really, although it's fantastic to have the imprint and everything, it's also a sandbox. It's a place where you can try things, see what works, right across the whole publishing sort of pipeline. And slowly but surely, things start to reveal themselves. The length of time is very important. And also, we're also trying to answer these big issues that Darren mentioned, but there are quite a lot of them. So you kind of answer them one by one in the best way you can. So the whole of publishing is aware that they need to speed up, but it's just it is a bit difficult to get there.
It's a slow process.
It's a slow and steady process, I think. But then, when a book takes a year, I mean, how much slower can you get? In some ways, you're waiting a year to find out another you're waiting 2 years to find out whether something actually worked, you know. So the idea is the whole of publishing doing this, and it's all at different stages. We should start to see more momentum that tells you how change is going. And then, of course, we have things like the CLP, Reflecting Realities Report, which is a direct sort of measure for us, a yardstick for us, you know, and that goes up and down, as you've seen. It's really too early to see whether or not it's working totally, but at the same time, there has been progress. So, you know, we're
Yeah.
constantly in this pushing and pulling sort of state of affairs.
And thank you, Ken. And at least we're in this space, or
Definitely,
as you say, progress is being made,
definitely.
although it's slow and there are challenges still. At least we're having these conversations, and the publishing industry is aware that change
Most
is
definitely.
hoped for by those who are receiving the publications. Thank you,
Most definitely.
Ken. For Hannah, it's your turn. So, as a practicing teacher, what's the most common misconception you see amongst educators when they first start to try to diversify their classroom library? And how does the Teachers Reading Challenge potentially help them to overcome that?
Yeah, well, one of the most common misconceptions, and I say this to myself first and foremost as I reflect on my own teaching career, is the misconception that visibility is enough. I think it's very easy to, well, not easy, it's very expensive to fill your bookshelf with diverse stories. And it's fantastic. Visibility is fantastic. And it sets a foundation for libraries. And we've all done it where there's just so much to do in a school day and everything just becomes a bit of a checklist. And it's when you actively diversify your bookshelf and even diversifying your curriculum. I know we've touched on this already. You'll reap the rewards long term. It's also acknowledging how you're using a text in a classroom. Are you highlighting the diversity in the story? Or are you normalizing that diversity, which is just as important? Um, these books are in a classroom and curriculum because of their high quality content, not only because it includes own voices, cultural settings, representation. And I think that's when the Teachers Reading Challenge comes in really handy because it helps overcome that kind of misconception by encouraging us as educators to read more widely and to reflect on ourselves as well as those reading those stories. And it gets us to think of it as readers first rather than educators. And when we're selecting materials, it makes us think critically about it, to look at bias and authenticity in a text as well. And in short, I think the challenge is it transforms that kind of diversification of from a checklist exercise and it helps educators move on from kind of just adding diverse books into the classroom to building a really inclusive reading culture in a school, which is so important. Honestly, it makes a world of difference when it comes to those students.
Thank you, Fahana. Yeah, I'm thinking about my own work with teachers and having been a teacher, that opportunity to experience books as a reader yourself is really
Mhm.
important, isn't it? That you're not just picking them up for what you consider to be a purpose, and as you said, almost decorating
Mm.
your shelves with books of different kinds, but actually engaging with them as a reader and being able to reflect on that to support your pupils in terms of what you might recommend or what you might talk about together. So yeah, that sounds fantastic. Thank you. Okay, over to the next phase of our questions. So I'm going to turn back to Ken again. Ken, when you set up Kamusha Books, what challenges did you face convincing those major publishers that you were talking about earlier to take risks on inclusive stories? Um, and how can teachers help make sure the books that are getting through that kind of chain, the sort of longer process of publication, how can they make sure those books thrive once they're in the classroom?
Okay. So the challenges you face when you're setting up something so new and so different in a more corporate publishing house are numerous actually because it is new, and so that means that there's the systems that there are in place aren't exactly tuned into this level of difference. So the intention was very, very high. The excitement was very, very high. But in actual practice, we were coming up against the where the process just didn't allow for different thinking, or because of time, because of cost, and whatever. And so one of the challenges was trying to get over that hurdle. And I realized very quickly that instead of instruction or kind of being authoritative about it. It was more about coaching people to open up their ways of thinking as editors, designers, salespeople, and so forth, to the possibility that this could work. And it's just adjusting the process, adjusting yourself to the process rather than the other way around. So that was something which took a lengthy period of time, took a long time. But you felt it when it had actually turned around, you'd actually felt, okay, this is actually, it's working. There are some people who are beginning to evangelize about what the list is trying to do within the building, and this is what you want, really, because it's not a one-person job. The other problem I can remember was that talking internationally, talking to publishers internationally, I think getting them to understand what we were understanding, especially when every single country has a different way of looking at inclusion and diversity, belonging, the whole was like snakes and ladders. It was just absolutely confusing because, you talk to the US and they are in some ways very far ahead. It's a much more mature area in terms of publishing, but at the same time, the UK has got a more nuanced assessment and a nuanced way of dealing with the way communities integrate. Right? You talk to countries in Europe, and you'd find that they were saying things as bluntly as, we don't have this as a problem in our country, kind of thing, where you have to now convince them that actually it is going to be something they have to tackle. So, there were lots of different types of discussions, and you had to always be on your guard to make sure that you were talking in the right way to the right publisher. This was very, very interesting. A lot of publishers waited a while to see if the list would actually how the list would do before deciding to engage, which I think was also anticipated. Anything new, they have to wait and see. So we had those kinds of challenges. I can't remember what the second part of the question
Yeah, it
was.
was a long question.
Oh,
Forgive me.
I was rambling on it.
How can teachers make sure that once these some of the more inclusive texts have been published, that they can thrive once they're in the classroom? Have you found ways that they can really showcase them and get children to engage with them or make the most of them?
I think one of the ways teachers can help us is to, when I say us, I mean all the whole inclusive community, is by actually talking to the publisher and saying, we got this book, this is what we think about it. That type of feedback is so useful because we feed that back to salespeople who can use that, and it builds the confidence. They can also invite us to talk about the process, the publishing process, because not many people know publishing and the actual process and how long why, all the whys that go with the publishing process. I'm always happy to talk to teachers and take them through this. So I think those two things really, really help. Obviously, promoting the books if they like them is hands down the best way to do it. But it's letting us know that they're doing that, because then we can also try to support them in turn. So, and I think Book Squad, for instance, is one of those places you can do that. And we can come to that. But I think those are simple but effective ways to help us build the confidence we need to keep building, basically, the list.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I hadn't really thought from the other side of the publishing fence how important it is to give that positive feedback back to the publishers and say we want more of these, or we really relishing these kind of publications. So that's really thought-provoking. Thank
Yeah,
you.
I mean, so just very quickly, we can see sales figures, and I think those are useful in some ways. But it's the why and the anecdotes in between the sales figures which lead us to maybe increase the number of books that look that way or read that way, look or sound that way, I think.
Yeah.
Though you don't get that from sales figures necessarily. So it's very, very useful. So like I said, I'm always happy to talk to teachers or anyone who wants to talk about those things.
Brilliant, thank you. So Darren, you focused in your Secret Garden research on how racially minoritized characters are often stereotyped or sidelined, or at least your research shows that. What do you think that teachers should be looking out for to make sure that the representation in their book choices is meaningful rather than tokenistic? I mean, Farhana's sort of touched on that a little bit already, but what are your thoughts?
Okay. So I guess one of the things to think about is the way that those books are used in the classroom. So, my experience in my Good Immigrant essay was that I had this box of multicultural books that I'd spent my own money on because I wanted to update the book collection, but the year two children had clocked that they weren't the literacy hour books, that their books didn't have the same significance. So I think we need to be careful about not bringing in books almost like a sort of little adornment, sprinkling on the cake. They need to be integral to our curriculum work. Now, that doesn't mean every book needs to be about a black or brown child in our curriculum. I'm not advocating that at all. I do think there's an issue around, I think, for teachers, we don't get enough CPD around children's literature. When I was a full-time teacher, it was very hard to keep abreast of what was coming out. There's, I think, research, which Helen, you'd probably be more familiar with, that teachers often end up teaching the books that they read as kids. So we have a strange generational lag, that the writer themselves are often writing about their own childhood. So we, in effect, have two generations going back. So one of the most meaningful things that happened for me when I was a teacher in Southwark was a teachers' reading group was set up, and we were given a Key Stage 1 book, a Key Stage 2 book, which we read, and we were then invited to discuss them. And for the first half of the session, we could only discuss them as works of literature, because teachers do have this phenomenon of how can I use this? And I think being held back to teach them think of them as literature first of all, before we went about their utility, really sort of opened a door in my mind. It was Ali Moore who ran that, who now runs, I think, Cheltenham Children's Literature Festival. So that was really important. And on the other hand, teachers just don't get enough CPD around multicultural education, anti-racist education. In fact, they probably get less now than when I was doing my 4-year teaching degree, and I felt we didn't get enough then. So we're talking about something that sits at the intersection of two fields that aren't valued highly enough. And what that can produce is a certain level of teacher anxiety, where people think I'm on territory I'm not completely comfortable with. You're asking me to do discussion where I don't quite know what the child's going to say, and therefore I'll back off. My advice is firstly to seek out good commentary on children's books, and again, I think that's an area we could do with improving in this country. I would say read books for keeps. It's free. I write for them, but it's free, so there's no money there. Read books for keeps. Their reviews are some of the most in-depth ones. Just Imagine reviews are really thoughtful as well. And then look at the lit in color lists that are compiled, which again go through a really rigorous, thoughtful process. And I think because I'm involved with Reflecting Realities, and those reports, the narrative part of those, they're authored by Farah Saruk, are really thoughtful in helping us detect stereotypes. So we need to invest a bit of our own time in sort of the sort of CPD that in ideal conditions we would be getting anyway. And one of the things that Lit in Colour, I think we've noticed, is that there has been progress by working in secondary on exam boards. But it then comes with the problem, as I say, of teacher knowledge and teacher confidence when some of the topics are topics that they're less familiar with. So there is something about thinking about a pedagogy where you do your best to be informed. You don't just sit there going, oh, the children will tell me everything I need to know. You update your knowledge through, as I say, reading things like Books for Keeps, but you also listen really carefully to children, and that sometimes children might know a little bit more about a certain topic than you, and you can be attentive to that as well. So that's a shift in pedagogy from the idea of the teacher being the expert about everything in the book and being the one who will tell children definitively what the book means, to the model that people like Michael Rosen, Aidan Chambers have been talking about for years, that meaning is the meeting of writer and reader, and that having a community of readers means that we can actually come to richer readings of meanings.
Brilliant. Thank you, Darren. So much to think about there. And yes, you're absolutely right. The research in this country, we've completed a study recently actually with a large number of student teachers, nearly 600 student teachers coming into the profession, and those same challenges persist in terms of knowledge of children's literature, which is one of the reasons why we set up the Teachers Reading Challenge, which we're talking about today as another great resource to sort of get your own reading repertoire, build that and discuss that with others and look around different themes and resources to support you. I saw Fahana while you were talking almost on the edge of her seat, so I'm sure she's thinking about things related to connecting some of these challenges and supporting teachers. Fahana, you've seen pupils react to your own books. Can you share a moment where representation really shifted a child's engagement with reading? Because the point of all of this is to do that, isn't it? We're thinking about changing the books that we read and what we talk about together to really get those children engaged. What taught you about the power of story in the classroom?
Well, what's interesting about this is I've only ever taught like physically in a classroom when schools that I've had about 400, 500 kids. And I could probably count on one hand how many of those kids are from, I think it's a global majority that's said now, isn't it? And by that I mean children that are Black, brown, Asian, dual heritage, not white children. And what I will say though is there were no children that looked like didn't have brown skin. There were no kids with brown skin in those schools, and staff as well. Staffing is very reflective of that as well. So I was very much an anomaly in that school. But what I will say is my first ever class is my NQT. I think it's called ECT now, and my NQT year is I wrote Not Now Noor, which is about hijab and a child wanting to know why her mother wears a hijab. I wrote that based on every single bizarre, utterly bizarre question I had from children in my class and parents of those children in my class as well. And what I will say is that maybe it's the privilege that, it's strange saying privilege, but the privilege that I have as a brown person where when children ask curious questions, there isn't that fear there of answering them if it's a question about hijab. So, for example, a child once said to me, "Oh, does Voldemort live on the back of your head? Do you wear it in the shower?" Things where I think if I wasn't a brown, visibly Muslim person, would I have been able to answer those questions to those children? So that's where I think that kind of conversation that Darren touched on about kind of knowing what to say in the context. And I had the privilege of being able to answer those questions. So the reactions that I had from those kids were fantastic because their connection to it was me and they could relate to it through me. And they're so curious, and to see a world that is both equally familiar, familiarity was from me, and also unfamiliar to that of their own. It was fantastic. But going into classrooms as an author as well, so I still work in classrooms quite a lot. And with Not Now Noor, Ibrahim's Perfectly, The Misadventures of Mina Mahmood, the way my inner child is reveling and just jumping up and down when I see kids that look like me find themselves in those stories, the way they can see their mums in their traditional garments and their cultural foods, which I know based on my own past is that you'd be terrified to even bring up in school because of the fear that your food smells and people think it's inappropriate. Adults as well, not just kids. I can't describe that feeling enough. And I actually, rather than think of the classroom children, I actually think of my own son who's 2 years old. And I think of my teenage nieces and nephews. And for my son, it's very much the norm. He's a blank canvas. And for him to have the privilege of having such a diverse bookshelf with purpose, just for him to see stories with him in it, with his parents in it. He doesn't know any different. But when my teenage nieces and nephews, they picked up a book with a character that looks like them, it was like shock. They couldn't believe that they were part of that story. And it's very healing to see their reactions and to see themselves represented. And if a child sees their reality in a story, they'll pick it up. They'll not just read it, but they'll have that sense of belonging. They'll engage in it, whether it's emotionally, reflectively, or create their own stories, because that world of books, even as an author thinking that I would get published or not, it finally feels like it's open to them. And as teachers, as educators, and anyone in the field, it isn't just our role to teach them how to read or teach them to enjoy books. It's to help those children kind of discover their story, that their story is worth telling and it's worth reading, it's worth publishing. I think that's what's so important when it comes to these kind of stories.
Thank you, Fahana. I think, yeah, that message is coming through really strongly from all of you. That it's about offering opportunities to see yourself in stories, even though you might want to read something else, but to recognize that you're valued and your family and heritage is valued enough to be represented in stories that we see every day in the classroom. Thank you. Now we're moving on to be a bit more practical, which I know that anybody who's an educator in the audience will be interested in some kind of practical ways to support the children, young people they're working with. So for Hannah, just to come back to you again, often teachers we talked about already may not have a really wide repertoire of different texts, and they also are time poor and resource poor in terms of developing it. If a teacher could only add 3 inclusive titles to their library this year, what would you prioritise and why? Do you have some recommendations for us?
So I've thought about this, and I considered using this as an opportunity to promote my own books, my picture books and mail group, but I'll hold back because there's so much out there. But if I had to choose 3, I love, and I'm very much going down the line of Diary of a Wimpy Kids picked up all the time. Captain Underpants, all those kind of books are picked up so much. And there's Tom Gates, all of those books are picked up. But there are very similar books. And it's what I think Ken said about it's already out there, and it's about using those stories and making it more diverse. But the Little Bad Man series by Hamza Arshad, fantastic. Anisha, Accidental Detective by Serena Patel, and the whole Sam Wu series by, I think it's Katie and Kevin Sang. All of those books do a fantastic job in kind of normalizing that diversity and representation. So if I could have those in my bookshelf in a classroom and someone just buys them for me, that would be it.
Oh, thank you for Hannah. And I can see, I think you're probably setting people off in the chat, making their own recommendations. So please do feel free to have that conversation. But yes, those kind of humorous everyday stories that children, particularly the ones we talk about as middle grade readers, that kind of year 3, 4 area, they really like them. And it's making diversifying those sort of selections is a great way forward. Thank you for Hannah. So, Darren, coming back to how we can help teachers a bit more, how do you think they might weave inclusive text into daily classroom life rather than leaving them as a one-off? You've talked a lot about the connection between inclusivity in the sort of curriculum. We need to think about it in lots of different ways. How can they move away from the idea of a one-off project or a themed week?
Yeah, that's a good question, and of course there are sometimes, whether it's Black History Month or particular religious festivals, there are times when certain books are displayed in classrooms, sometimes school libraries, public libraries, and that can be completely appropriate. The concern is that that's the only time those books get displayed. I was recently reading a student's work where a teacher had tried to diversify and had a diverse bookshelf, but then had bookshelves. And I think we really need to avoid that. I inadvertently had that in my own classroom because these were the books I bought, which were good and recent and were far more diverse. They weren't exclusively diverse, but they were far more than the other books. So the obvious thing is just to make sure that we're integrating books into our offer. And that it's there in the curriculum, it's there in the reading that we do, the class reading, that we look at curriculum maps if we've got the role, and we look at what coverage. When do you encounter a black girl in your literacy hour in your journey of school, or a hijabi? If you don't encounter them at any point, that seems a bit of a strange thing to me. It seems to point out something about, again, who belongs in books. You've asked for practical, and I hope it's not too sort of theoretical to say, I think just keeping alive the idea of similarity and difference is really important. I think we can go wrong in education when we only emphasize similarity and we create taboos around difference. I mean, Farhana talked about food, and I can remember asking the children what they eat, and they all just said chicken and chips, chicken and chips. And it was just this great, equalizer where they wouldn't talk about the food their families prepared at home. But if we only talk about difference, then we miss out on opportunities for similarity as well. And I think that's really important when we think about how we're trying to read across difference. We do that with the belief that we can achieve something, that there is enough similarity that that meaning is attainable. And I think if we get too focused on difference and a kind of stay in your lane approach, then we actually signal to white teachers and white students, this stuff isn't really for you. It's for black and brown kids, and that's going to be counterproductive, I think, to what we're trying to do. So I think in all my sort of curriculum planning, my book choice, the way we organize books, that tension between similarity and difference should be alive. Farhana mentioned like the Tom Gates and those books. Zainab Mian's Planet Omar series. You could put those together very easily and talk about these sort of, that sort of writing with pictures style of, perhaps early chapter books. You don't need to put Zainab Mian's book in, we're now looking at Muslim children or Muslim representations. At the same time, I wouldn't shy away from talking about Omar and the fact that Omar's parents are from Pakistan, and on one of the books they traveled there. So I think it's keeping both of those facts alive that actually just deals with the reality of the world. We're all different and we're all similar. And if children can understand that in their education and in their literature, then I think we might be in a healthier place.
Thank you. I think that's beautifully explained. Thank you, Darren. Yeah, I shouldn't try and talk over that because that's a really wonderful thought to hold on to, I think. So I was reflecting as you were talking on my own experience of teaching both in a school where most children came from non-white backgrounds and also teaching in rural Cornwall, which was not at all diverse, and having those conversations with colleagues in Cornwall about why do we need to do that here. And these kind of challenges persist, but thank you. That's a really good way of thinking about it. So Ken, um, you mentioned a little bit earlier about your involvement with HarperCollins Book Squad. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how that might help teachers to navigate and choose inclusive books with some confidence.
I think the Book Squad brings together the whole children's division, the whole HarperCollins children's division, Collins, Farshaw, Barronty Stoke, HarperCollins children's books, all together, and offers the books that they have, to people, to encourage this idea of choosing to read or reading for pleasure. I mean, I prefer to say choosing to read because it can be a choice. And so I think the website itself is very, very interactive in the sense that it allows people to go on there, make recommendations, to start the conversations between each other. It allows you to visit it as a teacher or as a reader, which I think is a really good innovation. And all of these things are designed to help people share their enjoyment of a book, which hopefully in turn leads them to spreading the love of reading. In the wider sense, it'd be great if the whole of publishing had a book squad, and could actually take this on this countrywide, nationwide sort of scale, so that all people, children who read, readers are readers, right? I think that's what we can all say. They'll read as long as it's interesting to them. They're going to read. It doesn't really matter that much what the background is, which I think is one of those reasons we can explain. Before the days of coining the phrases of diversity and inclusion, you had people growing up reading books that didn't have them in them, particularly, but they still managed to get through the world, navigate, become professors like Darren or authors like myself. So readers are readers. I think that is clear. Something like Book Squad, I think, encourages those readers to spread that excitement with their teachers, with their parents as well. I think we're in the age where parents are guided a lot more by what children want. They will listen, and more are sort of happy to let the child it's their domain. I think it helps to see if a child can choose the book they want. That's quite a good thing. So I think, definitely Book Squad was set up with that in mind. And of course, to follow the whole campaign of making every child a proud reader.
Thank you, Ken. That's really interesting. And of course, that runs alongside and really complements the work of the Teachers Reading Challenge that we're talking about today. So I'm going to ask Fahana to tell us a little bit about how that's helped her. So thank you, Ken. Fahana, how has the challenge, the Teachers Reading Challenge, supported you and your colleagues in refreshing your own reading habits and bringing new energy into the classroom?
You know, I'm getting so locked in the chat and I'm just reading it as I go that I'm not a part. I'm trying to listen and do that at the same
Did you
time.
take in my question? Do you need to
I did
again?
take it in. I did. I just saw lovely Helen from Manchester message, and I've just been reading all the messages. But it's so lovely to have such an engaging audience. Um, so as an ambassador, how has the challenge supported kind of my reading habits? Yeah. So I'm no longer classroom based, but I do work with a number of schools to help update their curriculum and incorporate stories with representation in a seamless way. And I think the reading challenge is a real catalyst when it comes to change, when it comes to our reading culture. It's so easy, and I've done it myself, so easy to fall into habits of using previous year's curriculum, using previous years. And that adds up. If you're using the one from the year before, you're using work from worksheets, you're using stories that were used previously, they probably got it from the year before, and so on. And it's really easy to fall into habits of using previous years to help ease the planning load. And teachers already have so much to do. But when you know better, it's important to do better. And the reading challenge is it helps you step out of your comfort zone. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. It's all there. The support is there. Whether you're struggling to choose a book, whether it's for resources, pedagogy, staff meetings, it's all there. And when you have a chance to kind of reconnect with that love for reading yourself, not just as a teacher, as a reader, there's such a buzz in the classroom, and kids can tell if you are enjoying doing something. So I actually, as a teacher, maths was my thing. Maths, I love teaching maths. And every single child in my class preferred maths over English. And it's because I had that buzz for it. And when you are reading and when you have that buzz yourself, your children will reciprocate that and use what's available to you. The reading challenge, everything's there for you to use, and it's going to have a lasting impact on those kids. And it's just putting in the work now for it to have that kind of, it's immeasurable. It's actually immeasurable. But yeah, I think just don't reinvent the wheel. It's there, use it. It's literally all there.
Fantastic. And we're getting loads of other resources and links being shared in the
Yeah.
chat. So it's there's a super collection of things that you can draw on. And I can tell why you're an ambassador for the Teachers Reading Challenge there, for Hannah, your enthusiasm.
One thing I
Go
do
on.
want to add, and I know it's not on my question, but
Go
I
for
think
it.
we do have quite a few educators in here, is just little and often. Little and often. You can't fit everything into the curriculum, you can't fit everything into the school day, but have the books out, have a selection of books out on the tables when the kids come in for the register. While do a silent register at lunchtime so the kids can sit and listen to an audio book. Have a child who's doing a fantastic job reading that week to read the class book. Put a fire up from YouTube and do a class read together. Little and often, it makes the world a difference.
Oh, thank you so much. And all of those beautiful role models that you're giving there and talking about reading and moving it from something that is very curriculum or literacy hour or English curriculum constrained into something that is pleasurable,
Yeah.
enjoyable, and as Ken said, about children getting to choose, being really core to that. Right, so we're into our last 8 minutes, everybody. Wow, it has flown. Thank you for your wonderful contribution. So our last task is to have a think about some recommendations for two children I think we're going to have time to focus on. So we've got a couple of little case studies here which I'm going to share, and everybody who's been joining in so beautifully in the chat, you can also contribute any suggestions. So we've got a case study of an 8-year-old child who's from an asylum seeking background and who says they don't like reading. They like jokes, they like facts, and they like football. And you think they've never read a chapter book with a character whose life or identity feels relatable to them. So do share, any of our panelists and people in the chat, what might you recommend for that 8-year-old child? I'm sure it's a shame we haven't given them an imaginary name. I'd like them to have an imaginary name, but we haven't given them one. Anybody? Fahana, what might you share?
I actually had a child in my online school that and after doing some digging, I actually found the book in the works, which I love. And it's a serial from, I think it's Hachette, and it's called
Yes.
Football Superheroes. And it's a 10-book series. It's not one I would normally pick up, but it seemed perfect. One of the books is about Mohammed Saleh, and it's short chapters, simple language, fun facts, lots of images, and it's real. I think that's the important thing. It's real. It's a real life inspirational story and a role model of a young lad who came from a small village in Egypt to this whole unknown, which is something that they could in some way or another find relatable to their own background.
That sounds fantastic. Thank you. Darren or Ken, any thoughts about that one?
Um, Not a specific book, but I would say the person to talk to is the OG influencer, which is the school librarian or the
Good
librarian.
call. Yes.
That is the person who's going to set you on the right track because they're the ones who will have knowledge of all the different reading levels. And I think that that is the place to start because they're going to listen to this person. They're going to hear what the strengths and weakness and what the likes and dislikes are. And then they're going to pick out a range of books that might be worth trying. And the fact that the child is going to try a few books before setting on the right one is the point because they're going to,
Yes.
aren't they? They're going to read them. So I think it's down to the to librarians. I would say they're in a much better place to.
That's a great recommendation, Ken. So, yes, you could go and talk to your public librarian, couldn't you? And of course, the reading
Yeah.
agency works really closely.
Yeah.
Obviously, some of our secondary colleagues, they might have designated school
Yeah.
librarians, and even in our primary schools, we do have. There's often somebody who's an expert who's great at giving those recommendations. So, yeah, that would be a good call.